Hello everyone. Let's jump straight into a question that quietly decides whether a PMO will succeed or struggle. In professional terms, assessing organizational maturity means evaluating how capable, consistent, and effective an organization is in managing projects, programs, and portfolios. Now, let me say that in very simple English. Organizational maturity is about how ready the organization really is, not how confident it sounds, not how many tools it owns, but how well it actually plans, delivers, and learns from its work. You have probably seen this at the office. One team plans carefully and delivers calmly. Another team reacts at the last minute and keeps firefighting. Same company, different maturity levels. So the key takeaway here is this. Before a PMO decides what to do, it must understand how mature the organization already is. And once we accept that maturity matters, the next question becomes, what does maturity actually look like in real life? And that brings us smoothly into the next scene. Let's break that down together. From a professional perspective, organizational maturity reflects how standardized, repeatable, and predictable project management practices are across the organization. Stay with me here. In simple words, maturity answers questions like, do people follow similar practices or does everyone work their own way? Do projects succeed by luck or by design? You've probably seen low maturity environments where success depends on heroic individuals. When they leave, everything falls apart. Higher maturity environments don't rely on heroes, they rely on systems. I once saw a team celebrate finishing a project despite having no plan at all. That felt good short term, but it was a warning sign. Mature organizations don't depend on miracles. So now that we understand what maturity represents, the next natural question is, why should a PMO care so much about this? Now let's talk about why maturity assessment is so important for a PMO. Professionally, PMOs assess organizational maturity to ensure that PMO structures, services, and controls match the organization's real capabilities. Let me simplify that. A PMO should never be stronger or heavier than the organization can handle. You have probably seen PMOs introduce strict controls in organizations that aren't ready. People resist, work slows down, and trust disappears. That's what happens when maturity is ignored. I once saw a PMO roll out complex governance in a fast-moving team. People created shortcuts just to survive. When the PMO simplified its approach, cooperation returned. So now that we see maturity as a guide for PMO design, the next step is understanding how maturity is actually assessed. Let's explore that. From a professional standpoint, assessing organizational maturity involves examining behaviors, processes, skills, tools, and decision-making practices related to project work. Let's break this down together. Maturity is not just about documents. It's about how people really work when pressure is high. You've probably seen beautifully documented processes that nobody follows. On paper, maturity looks high. In reality, it's low. A good maturity assessment looks beyond paperwork. I once asked a simple question during an assessment. When a project goes off track, what actually happens? The answers revealed far more than any checklist ever could. So, now that we understand how maturity is assessed realistically, the next question is, what does a PMO do with this information? Now let's talk about using the results. Professionally, maturity assessment results help PMOs decide where to start, what to improve, and what to avoid for now. In simple words, maturity tells the PMO where to focus and where to be patient. You have probably seen PMOs try to improve everything at once. That usually leads to exhaustion and disappointment. A maturity-based approach focuses on small, meaningful improvements. I once saw a PMO decide not to introduce new tools because teams were still struggling with basic planning. That decision saved time, money, and frustration. So now that we understand how maturity guides PMO actions, the final step is understanding how maturity changes over time. And that brings us into our final scene. Let's bring everything together calmly and clearly. Assessing organizational maturity helps a PMO understand where the organization is today so it can guide realistic, sustainable improvement over time. In simple words, maturity assessment prevents the PMO from pushing too hard or moving too slowly. When a PMO respects maturity, People feel supported instead of judged. Progress becomes steady instead of painful. Improvement becomes possible instead of forced. So now that you have mastered how to assess organizational maturity and why it matters, you are perfectly ready to move forward. We are going to discuss the PMO value proposition in details in next chapter.